The question that has drawn renewed attention to the case is simple, but unsettling in its timing. Why has Gus Lamont's father stepped forward now? For months, the public conversation around the disappearance of the 4-year-old boy has been shaped largely by official statements from South Australia Police, the efforts of search crews across the outback, and the quiet resilience of the Lamont family. The father's return to the public space has introduced a new point of interest, not because of any confirmed development in the investigation, but because of how rare it is for a case this complex to remain without clear answers for so long. To understand why his appearance matters, it is necessary to revisit the context that has made this disappearance one of the most closely followed cases in South Australia in recent years. On the afternoon Gus went missing, the weather across the far north region was typical of early autumn outback conditions. Dry air, warm light, and long shadows stretching across red earth. The homestead at Oak Park Station stood isolated, surrounded by open terrain and sand rises that locals know can distort distance and perspective. It was around 5 p.m. when Gus was last seen playing near a low dune a short distance from the house. By 5:30 p.m., when his grandmother called out to him and received no response, the first search began. At 8 p.m., police were notified. Within hours, flashlights, vehicles, and experienced station workers moved across the property. Despite these efforts, no confirmable trace of the boy was located. This absence of physical evidence formed the backbone of public concern. Outback soil often records movement clearly, especially the light, distinctive footprints of a young child. Yet, across the initial search perimeter, no such tracks were found. No clothing was located, no belongings, nothing that could provide a firm direction of travel. As the search expanded in the days that followed, an even more puzzling reality settled in. Even with helicopters, drones, SES volunteers, ADF support, and local property owners working side by side, the landscape offered no definitive sign of where the child had gone. During this time, the father remained largely absent from media coverage. This is not unusual in Australian missing child cases. Some families choose to stay silent for personal, cultural, or emotional reasons. Others prefer to focus on cooperation with investigators rather than engage with public speculation. In the Lamont case, his silence was neither framed as suspicious nor particularly highlighted by authorities. It existed simply as one part of the broader story, a family coping with a crisis that unfolded within minutes and then stretched into weeks. Still, when he eventually reappeared, whether through a statement, an interview, or a presence noted by media, his return naturally caught public attention. In the context of a case where information has been limited and outcomes uncertain, any new voice from within the family carries weight. Viewers, readers, and social media audiences were quick to ask whether this change might indicate a shift in the investigation or reveal something previously unknown. These questions grew not because police suggested wrongdoing, but because the uncertainty surrounding the case has left many Australians searching for clarity in a situation that has offered very little. South Australia Police, however, maintained a consistent position. There is no evidence of foul play. They have reiterated this point across multiple briefings. While they continue to investigate all possibilities, as is standard procedure in any long-running missing child case, they have been clear in stating that the available information does not support the conclusion that a criminal act has occurred. At the same time, they have not ruled out any scenario. The case remains open. Task Force Horizon continues to assess leads, modelling, and expert input. The father's re-emergence does not change the official framework, but it does reopen public interest in how the investigation is progressing. For many viewers across Australia, the timing and nature of his appearance introduce an emotional layer that sits alongside the factual one. In true crime reporting, particularly in an Australian context, audiences engage not only with data, but with the human elements. Family dynamics, personal statements, and moments where grief, hope, or reflection come through. A parent returning to speak after a long period of silence will inevitably invite questions. Some will interpret his involvement as a hopeful sign of cooperation. Others may wonder whether he has new information or insights. Still others may view it simply as a natural part of a prolonged search, in which different family members speak at different times, depending on their ability to cope with public attention. The critical point, and the one that must guide the tone of any factual analysis, is that public curiosity is not evidence. The father's appearance cannot be used to infer guilt, innocence, knowledge, or involvement. It is a detail within a much larger narrative, and its impact lies more in how the community reacts than in what it reveals about the case itself. South Australian true crime reporting requires caution here. Behaviour under stress varies dramatically, and family members often navigate their grief in ways that outsiders may misunderstand. The real question, then, is what his presence means for the investigation. Does it provide new context for SAPOL? Does it reflect a desire to re-engage the public in the search for answers? Does it signal a readiness to address speculation, or simply a need to speak about his son? These are inquiries, not accusations, that form the backbone of responsible analysis. They do not suggest wrongdoing. Instead, they acknowledge that in an open investigation, every shift in communication can influence how the public understands the timeline. This video begins from that premise. The aim is not to imply blame or point to conclusions that are not supported by evidence. Instead, the goal is to look at the father's re-entry into the public sphere as one part of a story that remains incomplete. His voice, like the voices of other family members, offers a human perspective that coexists with the technical elements of the search: the modeling, the aerial surveillance, the ground operations, and the environmental challenges posed by the outback. Each piece sits alongside the next, forming a layered understanding of why the case is still open and why authorities continue to examine every possibility. By starting with this moment, the father's return, we can explore what it adds to the broader picture of a search effort marked by unanswered questions. It is a beginning point for analysis, not a conclusion. And as the video progresses, we will consider how this appearance fits within the larger investigative landscape, what it means for the timeline, and why the disappearance of Gus Lamont continues to hold the attention of people across the country. Before the disappearance of Gus Lamont became a matter of national attention, the Lamont family lived a quiet, familiar life, shaped by the rhythm of working on an outback station. Oak Park, like many properties across South Australia's far north, operated within a landscape defined by long distances, self-reliance, and a close connection to the land. Daily routines often blended work and family in a way that is typical of station life. Tasks on the property, maintenance of equipment, monitoring stock, and tending to the demands of isolation. Within this framework, the family functioned as a small but interconnected unit, with responsibilities often shared among adults depending on the day and the workload. The father's role in this environment was consistent with the expectations of rural life. He spent significant time outdoors, working on repairs, moving between areas of the property, and managing tasks that required physical labor or technical attention. These duties, though unremarkable to those familiar with station operations, formed the structure of his everyday presence within the family. His interactions with his son reflected the patterns of a rural upbringing: brief check-ins during work, moments of supervision while passing between jobs, and time spent near the homestead during breaks or at the end of the day. In many outback families, children often play within sight of adults, but independently enough to develop confidence in the open space around them. This dynamic shaped much of Gus's daily routine and the way the family navigated life at Oak Park. The relationship between the father and Gus, as understood through available information, was grounded in the common patterns of outback parenting. Children are encouraged to explore within safe boundaries, learning to recognize features of the land around them. The grandmother played a central role in caring for Gus, especially during the day, providing structure and familiarity. The mother, involved in both family and property responsibilities, contributed to the routine in ways that complemented the grandmother's presence. The father's involvement, though influenced by his workload, remained part of a shared approach that many rural families adopt. Their interactions reflected a balance between independence and supervision, shaped by a community where children grow up accustomed to wide, open spaces. When the disappearance occurred, the focus quickly shifted from the usual patterns of family life to the urgent task of locating a missing child. In this transition, the father's actions and movements came under standard investigative review. South Australia Police interviewed him multiple times, not because his behaviour was unusual, but because procedure requires that all immediate family members be spoken to thoroughly. This aligns with the established principle in missing persons cases. Family members are always interviewed first. These interviews help investigators establish a timeline, understand the child's routine, clarify any recent behavioral changes, and determine whether there were external factors that might influence the search. For many viewers following the case, the father's absence from early media engagements became a point of curiosity. In the absence of clear developments or physical evidence, public attention often turns to details that stand out, even when they are explainable. His lack of early public presence, though not uncommon, became a repeated topic in online discussions. However, silence, or reluctance to speak publicly, does not indicate wrongdoing. People respond to trauma in varied ways, and many parents choose privacy in the immediate aftermath of distressing events. In remote communities, this preference for quiet and internal coping is particularly common. The father's focus during the early stages of the search appears to have been practical rather than public. Accounts from those involved indicate that he participated in search efforts and assisted police with relevant information. His primary interactions occurred behind the scenes, within the operational landscape of the investigation, rather than in front of cameras. This distinction is important, as media appearances are not a requirement and rarely reflect the full extent of a person's involvement. The absence of a public statement does not diminish the depth of a parent's experience or the significance of their role in the search. One factor that drew attention was the frequency with which SAPOL interviewed him. To the public, repeated interviews may appear unusual. Within investigative practice, they are standard. As new information emerges, timelines are refined, or modeling data shifts, investigators routinely revisit earlier conversations to ensure accuracy. The father's accessibility to police and willingness to participate in these steps indicate cooperation rather than concern. It reflects a process in which investigators systematically verify every element of the family's account to ensure no detail is missed. Across Australia, similar procedures have been applied in previous cases involving missing children in remote areas. Australian media coverage of such cases often walks a delicate line. While there is substantial public interest, journalists and broadcasters typically emphasise caution when discussing family members unless police indicate otherwise. This is rooted in both legal considerations and cultural expectations. Australian audiences tend to value fairness, reserving judgment until official information is released. As a result, coverage related to parents or relatives usually frames their involvement within the context of the investigation rather than speculation. The reporting surrounding Gus's father has followed this pattern, noting his actions, acknowledging public curiosity, but avoiding unsubstantiated conclusions. To understand why public attention forms around a parent, it helps to recognize the nature of unresolved cases. When evidence is limited and weeks pass without a breakthrough, people look to human elements for clarity. They examine interviews, statements, and behavior, often in an attempt to make sense of uncertainty. However, this tendency can easily create assumptions without factual basis. It is crucial to distinguish between interest and implication. The fact that the father became a topic of discussion does not alter the investigative position. Public interest does not equate to suspicion, and behavior that appears unusual in one context may be entirely ordinary in another. Moreover, the involvement of extended family, particularly the grandmother and mother, forms a key part of the narrative. Their roles in caring for Gus, their reactions during the initial search, and their communication with authorities contribute to a broader picture of a family responding to a crisis. The father's interactions with them reflect a shared experience rather than a separate one. Understanding this dynamic is essential to interpreting his place within the overall story. His position is not isolated. It is integrated into a wider framework of responsibility, emotion, and cooperation. As the case progressed, the father's re-emergence in the public sphere added a new dimension to how audiences perceived the family. Yet, from an investigative standpoint, his role remained consistent with established procedure. The absence of accusations from SAPOL, combined with the reaffirmed statement that there is no evidence of foul play, underscores the fact that his involvement has been treated within the normal parameters of a missing child investigation. In evaluating his role objectively, the focus must remain on verified information, his responsibilities within the family, his cooperation with police, his participation in search efforts, and the procedural necessity of repeated interviews. These details offer clarity without reliance on speculation. They help frame the father not as an outlier or a point of alarm, but as one component of a family confronting a situation no parent is prepared to face. His reappearance later in the investigation, which will be explored in subsequent sections, should be viewed not as an indicator of suspicion, but as an extension of his presence within the case. Whether driven by a desire to support the search, respond to public discussion, or express personal reflection, his actions fit within the broader landscape of a family navigating uncertainty. Establishing a reliable timeline is a fundamental part of any missing child investigation, and the disappearance of Gus Lamont is no exception. In cases involving remote properties, where movement can occur across large distances without witnesses, understanding where each family member was and what they were doing becomes essential. With limited physical evidence available, South Australia Police relied heavily on constructing an accurate chronology of the day Gus vanished. The father's movements formed one component of that process, examined in the same manner as the activities of all other adults present on the property at the time. What is known publicly about the father's location during the critical window is limited because SAPOL has not released detailed statements outlining his exact movements. This lack of disclosure is consistent with their approach to sensitive investigations. However, available reporting confirms that he was not with Gus at the moment the 4-year-old disappeared. This point aligns with the broader understanding that Gus was last seen by his grandmother near a low sand rise a short distance from the homestead just after 5 p.m. The father was elsewhere on the property, engaged in routine tasks that form part of station life. These activities typically involve maintenance, movement between structures, and outdoor work away from the immediate play area around the house. The exact time the father was notified is also not recorded in public briefings, but logically fits within the sequence of events described by the family. At approximately 5:30 p.m., the grandmother realized Gus was no longer within sight or responding to her voice. The family then began their own search across the immediate surroundings of the homestead. Given the nature of rural properties, it is reasonable to conclude that communication within the family occurred very quickly. Station workers and adults living together tend to share information rapidly, especially when a child cannot be located. SAPOL's subsequent statements imply that the father was made aware within minutes of the concern arising and joined the initial efforts to find the boy. His involvement in the early search efforts has been acknowledged in media reports that reference both family accounts and statements from community members familiar with the operation of Oak Park Station. These efforts included moving around the homestead perimeter, checking common play areas, scanning the nearby sand rises, and calling out systematically across open ground. In the first hours after a child goes missing, searches are often instinctive and highly active, driven by urgency rather than formal structure. The father's participation during this period reflects the typical response of a parent confronted with a sudden and unexplained disappearance. By 8 p.m., when police were contacted, The father was part of a family that had already undertaken multiple attempts to locate Gus. Once SAPOL officers arrived, the investigation moved into a structured phase. Police began gathering foundational information, including where each adult had been that afternoon, what tasks they were performing, and when they last saw Gus. The father provided an account of his movements and the activities he had been engaged in prior to the moment the alarm was raised. This information formed part of the initial timeline that SAPOL used to establish search zones and determine whether any part of the property required immediate priority. It is standard for police to revisit these statements as an investigation progresses, especially when physical evidence is minimal. For that reason, the father was interviewed several times. Each interview served a different purpose. The first established the basic chronology. Later interviews were likely used to clarify smaller details, confirm distances between locations, and check for any additional recollections that might assist with modeling a potential direction of travel for Gus. This approach is consistent with best practice in missing child cases, where investigators gather every possible detail about the hours leading up to the disappearance. Importantly, SAPOL has never indicated that inconsistencies were found in the father's account. The repetition of interviews does not imply wrongdoing. It reflects the complexity of reconstructing events that unfold quickly in remote areas. Memory under stress can be unreliable, and investigators know that parents often recall new details only after the initial shock subsides. Therefore, the process is designed not to challenge for the sake of challenge, but to ensure completeness and accuracy. The father also contributed to later search phases. As operations grew to include SES volunteers, ADF personnel, drone teams, and aerial support, police continued to consult the family to refine assumptions about Gus's behavior and routine. The father's understanding of the property's layout, distances between features, and the typical paths Gus might take became relevant to shaping the search grid. Outback stations can be complex, with uneven ground, pockets of vegetation, drainage lines, and stock routes influencing movement. Input from residents, including the father, helped search coordinators form realistic expectations about where a child might unintentionally wander. Timeline verification plays a crucial role in preventing misdirection. In many missing person cases, especially those involving children, authorities must determine whether the disappearance was voluntary, accidental, or the result of external involvement. By confirming the father's whereabouts and activities, SAPOL was able to strengthen the reliability of the broader family timeline. This allowed them to focus on terrain-based modeling rather than devoting extensive resources to internal family examination. The fact that police have not highlighted any timeline conflict suggests that the family's accounts aligned with physical observations and search outcomes. Another reason the family timeline is important is that it helps investigators assess opportunities for movement. Children in outback environments can cover surprising distances in short periods, especially when following an animal track, a visual landmark, or a slope that appears easier to walk. Understanding where each adult was positioned allows investigators to map how much time a child had to move unseen. In Gus's case, this modeling helped establish the wide search perimeter that later became central to the operation. SAPOL's decision not to disclose the full timeline publicly is not unusual. Sharing precise details could compromise the investigation, influence witness recollections, or encourage speculation. Police across Australia routinely withhold parts of the timeline in cases where certainty is limited and leads may still emerge. Maintaining privacy around family movements also protects individuals from unnecessary public scrutiny, especially when police have found no evidence of criminal activity. In summary, the timeline relating to the father sits within a broader investigative structure that prioritizes accuracy, procedure, and fairness. His location at the time of the disappearance, the moment he was notified, his actions during the early search, and the consistency of his statements all form part of the factual framework that SAPOL used to guide their search strategy. While the public has expressed curiosity about his role, the information available supports a straightforward interpretation. He was one of several adults on the property responding to a sudden emergency, cooperating with investigators, and participating in the extensive efforts to locate his son. The reappearance of Gus Lamont's father generated considerable interest across Australia, not because of any confirmed development in the investigation, but because of how heavily the public has invested emotionally in this case. In long-running missing child situations, especially those set in remote regions where the environment itself is both vast and unforgiving, public attention often shifts with each new voice added to the story. When the father stepped back into the public sphere, many Australians were quick to focus on what this might mean, even though South Australia Police had not indicated any change in the direction of the investigation. The curiosity reflects a broader pattern. When a case presents more questions than answers, people naturally gravitate toward any element that might provide clarity. Part of the reason the community responded strongly lies in the unusual nature of the disappearance. The outback is known for its expansive terrain, but it also typically reveals signs of movement, footprints, tracks, disturbed soil. In this instance, the absence of such indicators created a level of mystery that amplified public attention. Many Australians relate closely to rural life, even if they do not live in it. The outback is embedded deeply in the national identity, representing resilience, self-reliance, and connection to land. When a child goes missing, there without leaving a visible trace, the story resonates strongly. People want to understand how something so unsettling could occur in a setting that feels familiar, even iconic. This emotional investment influences how the public interprets new information. In a case where no clear evidence has been found, and where police have consistently maintained that all possibilities remain open, the arrival or reappearance of any family member, especially a parent, has a significant psychological impact. Many viewers subconsciously assume that a parent may hold knowledge that has not yet been shared, even if there is no suggestion of wrongdoing. This assumption is not based on fact, but on a natural desire to resolve uncertainty. When a case remains unresolved for an extended period, several psychological effects tend to emerge within the community. One of these is the search for certainty, a response that arises when people encounter narratives with missing pieces. In situations where the evidence is scarce and the investigation appears to stall, members of the public begin looking for individuals who might fill in the gaps. This does not necessarily reflect suspicion. Rather, it is a reaction to the discomfort created by ambiguity. The father's appearance, after a prolonged period of relative silence, naturally drew attention because many hoped it might provide context or direction. Another layer of this response is the focus on the nearest adult. In missing child cases, audiences frequently examine the behavior, tone, and timing of family members, even when investigators stress that there is no evidence of foul play. This is partly influenced by media narratives surrounding high-profile international cases, where parental statements or interviews were later scrutinized publicly. The Australian public, like audiences elsewhere, has internalized these patterns, sometimes applying them even when circumstances differ significantly. It is important to emphasize, however, that such reactions are not evidence-based and do not align with investigative principles. SAPOL repeatedly stated there was no indication that any family member had acted improperly. Social media became a major forum for discussion as the case progressed. Groups formed to exchange updates, analyze statements, and speculate about potential scenarios. These conversations often combined genuine concern with the desire to contribute meaningfully to the search for understanding. Within these discussions, the father's reappearance became a focal point. Some participants wondered whether his presence signaled a shift in the investigation. Others questioned the emotional tone of his comments or compared his statements to those of other family members. Still others provided participants to remain cautious, pointing out SAPOL's consistent position that no evidence of wrongdoing had been identified. Online speculation, while common in contemporary true crime culture, frequently leads to misunderstandings. One common misconception is that a parent's lack of early public visibility indicates either avoidance or guilt. In reality, psychological research shows that individuals respond to trauma in diverse ways, particularly in the initial stages. Some people seek privacy, avoiding interviews because they feel overwhelmed or fear saying something that could be misinterpreted. Others may be advised by police to limit media engagement until more information becomes available. In rural communities where media experience is limited, these concerns are especially prominent. Another misconception arises from repeated police interviews. In the public imagination, multiple interviews can appear confrontational or suspicious. However, investigators revisit family timelines routinely in missing child cases, particularly when physical evidence is limited. Each new lead, modeling update, or environmental analysis requires clarification of earlier details. Far from indicating suspicion, repeated interviews usually reflect the evolving nature of a complex investigation. Australian true crime reporting often addresses these misconceptions directly. Journalists and documentary makers commonly remind audiences that behaviour under stress cannot be used as a measure of guilt or innocence. This stance reflects legal expectations as well as cultural values. Australian audiences expect fairness, and media outlets frequently emphasise that public reactions should not substitute police findings. Coverage of the Lamont case has followed this principle. The father's actions have been acknowledged without interpretation beyond what is factual. Comparing community reactions, in this case, with previous Australian missing child investigations highlights a recurring pattern. In several cases from the Northern Territory, Queensland, and New South Wales, individuals who later proved uninvolved were initially subjected to public speculation simply because they were close to the child or appeared emotional in ways the public misread. These misunderstandings were corrected only after forensic evidence or verified witness accounts clarified the situation. The Lamont case appears to follow a similar trajectory, in which public attention focuses on family members due to the absence of clear physical clues rather than any factual basis for concern. This pattern demonstrates the difference between narrative-driven assumptions and evidence-based investigation. When physical evidence is minimal, the public often gravitates toward behavioral interpretation. Investigators, by contrast, prioritize objective data, timelines, environmental conditions, search grid modeling, and technical assessments. The father's reappearance is therefore significant in terms of public perception, but does not necessarily reflect any operational shift within SAPOL. It is also important to consider how the isolation of the outback influences public response. For many Australians, remote landscapes carry a sense of both beauty and vulnerability. The thought of a child disappearing into such an environment evokes strong emotional reactions. These reactions, in turn, intensify scrutiny of anyone associated with the case, even when there is no factual basis for suspicion. The father's presence becomes a symbolic touchpoint, a person audiences look to for reassurance, explanation, or closure. His re-emergence therefore carries emotional weight beyond its investigative relevance. In evaluating community responses, the key theme is that public attention is driven by the mystery of the case rather than by the actions of any individual. The combination of an unexplained disappearance, a vast search area, and a lack of physical evidence creates a vacuum into which speculation naturally flows. The father's appearance provides a narrative focal point, but does not alter the structure of the investigation or the conclusions drawn by police. Understanding this dynamic is essential in maintaining a fair and factual perspective. Community interest, even when intense, does not equate to evidence. Public curiosity reflects emotional investment, not investigative insight. The father's involvement remains consistent with that of a parent navigating the uncertainty and distress of a missing child case. His reappearance simply highlights the continued public engagement with a story that has touched communities across the country. In South Australian policing, the process of interviewing family members in a missing child investigation follows a well-established and carefully controlled framework. This framework is designed not only to gather accurate information, but also to ensure that every possible avenue is examined without bias. When it comes to the disappearance of Gus Lamont, the involvement of the father in repeated interviews is consistent with standard investigative procedure, rather than a reflection of suspicion or wrongdoing. Understanding this distinction is essential in interpreting SAPOL's actions in a factual and fair manner. At the foundation of SAPOL's approach is the principle that those closest to the child are usually the first to be spoken to. This is not because they are assumed to be involved, but because they possess the most direct knowledge of the child's routines, behavior, physical abilities, and emotional tendencies. In remote settings, such as Oak Park Station, where the surrounding environment is vast and the timeline is narrow, obtaining precise information from family members becomes even more crucial. Any small detail, where Gus preferred to play, how far he usually wandered, how he reacted to unfamiliar sights or sounds, can assist in shaping the initial search model. The father, like all primary caregivers, was part of this process. SAPOL interviewed him multiple times, but these interviews should not be interpreted through a criminal lens. Instead, they reflect the standard investigative pattern known as clarification interviews. These interviews allow investigators to refine their understanding of the timeline, assess whether earlier statements need expansion, and confirm details as new modeling or environmental data becomes available. Missing person investigations, particularly in harsh outback conditions, often evolve rapidly, and the search strategy must adapt accordingly. This adaptation requires updated information from those closest to the missing child. A key difference exists between interviewing to clarify and interviewing under suspicion. In the first scenario, the purpose is to gather information, cross-reference details, and validate environmental or behavioral assumptions. In the second scenario, interviews are conducted under caution, and investigators are required to disclose the reason for suspicion. SAPOL has never indicated that the father was interviewed under caution. All available public statements reiterate a consistent position. There is no evidence of foul play. This distinction is important because it highlights that the repeated interviews did not arise from allegations or criminal concerns, but from procedural necessity. SAPOL's public message has remained steady throughout the investigation. All possibilities remain open. This phrase has a specific meaning in Australian policing. It indicates that investigators have neither confirmed nor excluded any scenario, including misadventure, environmental factors, wandering beyond the original grid, accidental concealment in difficult terrain, or the possibility of being taken by another person. The statement reflects caution, not uncertainty. It communicates that no premature conclusions will be drawn without evidence, and that the investigation must remain flexible. This approach is particularly important in cases where physical evidence is sparse. There are several reasons SAPOL does not release full details of their interviews with any family member, including the father. First, doing so could compromise the integrity of the ongoing investigation. Interview content often includes personal information, emotional responses, and contextual details that could distort public perception if shared without explanation. Second, releasing statements prematurely could influence potential witnesses, inadvertently shaping their recollections or discouraging them from coming forward. Third, protecting the privacy of the family is an ethical obligation, especially in traumatic cases where public attention is intense. The Task Force Horizon team, specifically assembled to reassess key elements of the case, plays a crucial role in reviewing earlier interviews. Their responsibilities include analyzing the father's statements alongside environmental modeling, drone data, search grid records, and expert reviews of outback behavior patterns. These assessments are not intended to verify guilt or innocence, but to identify whether earlier information can be interpreted differently in light of new insights. The father's recollections, his movements on the day of the disappearance,
his understanding of the terrain, and his knowledge of Gus's habits form one part of a larger dataset feeding into advanced modeling systems. Legally, the absence of evidence indicating attempted harm or negligent conduct carries significant weight. Under South Australian law, investigators cannot label an individual as a suspect without concrete grounds. The repeated confirmation from SAPOL that there is no evidence of foul play signals that no such grounds exist. This does not mean the investigation is closed, nor does it suggest that every scenario is equally likely. Rather, it indicates that the father's involvement in the process remains procedural and informational, not criminal. The public often interprets repeated interviews as a sign of investigative pressure, but in reality, they reflect a methodical approach to reconstructing a timeline in a case where physical clues are minimal. Clarifying what was said, in what order, and how specific details align with environmental factors is an essential step. In complex search operations across large rural properties, investigators frequently revisit earlier statements to adjust search parameters. As weather patterns shift, visibility changes, and new modeling tools become available, earlier accounts are reassessed to ensure accuracy. In operational practice, SAPOL interview protocols emphasize neutrality. Officers conducting interviews are trained to create conditions in which the interviewee feels secure enough to provide complete and accurate information. This includes maintaining a non-accusatory tone, avoiding leading questions, and documenting every session carefully. The goal is always to support the investigative process, not to assign blame. By revisiting the father's statements at various stages, SAPOL ensures that their understanding of the events remains aligned with the most current evidence. This reassessment is not unique to this case. It is a cornerstone of modern policing across Australia. The fact that Task Force Horizon continues to analyse earlier interviews demonstrates the complexity of the search environment, not any suspicion directed toward the father. The father's willingness to participate, despite the emotional strain associated with recounting traumatic memories, also informs investigators' assessments. Cooperation does not guarantee accuracy, as memory under stress can be imperfect, but it does indicate a clear intention to assist. SAPOL evaluates statements in conjunction with external data rather than relying solely on recollection. From a legal standpoint, the father retains the same status he held from the outset, a family member providing information. Without evidence of wrongdoing, this status cannot change. Australian policing standards require fairness, respect, and objectivity, particularly in cases involving children. SAPOL's handling of the interviews reflects these standards. Their consistent messaging, combined with the structured review by Task Force Horizon, highlights an investigative process focused on clarity, accuracy, and the pursuit of answers within a difficult and emotionally charged environment. When the father of 4-year-old Gus Lamont stepped back into the public eye, his presence immediately drew attention. This reaction did not occur in a vacuum. It emerged from a combination of timing, the type of information he chose to share, and the long period of silence that preceded his appearance. In a case already marked by uncertainty, these elements combined to make his re-emergence a focal point for many Australians following the investigation. The first factor is timing. By the time he appeared, the disappearance was no longer a fresh story confined to the early days of a frantic search. It had become a long-running mystery, in which large-scale ground operations had been wound back, formal updates had become less frequent, and public frustration with the lack of answers had quietly grown. When a case reaches this stage, any development, however small, can feel significant. The father's appearance occurred against a backdrop of ongoing questions. No confirmed footprints, no clothing, no personal items, no definitive explanation. In such an environment, his decision to speak inevitably carried more weight than it might have in the first few days, when many voices and images were competing for space in the public narrative. The second factor is the nature of what he shared. Even when a parent does not disclose new factual information, their words often reveal their emotional stance: hope, acceptance, confusion, or a mix of all three. The content of his comments,
the way he described his son, and his reflections on the search and the investigation all became points of close attention for an audience already trying to make sense of a case with few concrete answers. These remarks provided additional material to interpret. Viewers listened for clues, not just factual ones, but emotional ones as well. Some heard determination, others heard exhaustion or resignation. The same sentences could be received in multiple ways, depending on the expectations and emotional state of the person watching. The third factor is the silence that came before. Extended periods without public comment from a close family member often stand out, especially in a media landscape where immediate statements and press conferences are common in high-profile cases. Yet, as with many aspects of human behavior under stress, this silence can stem from a range of reasons that have nothing to do with guilt or concealment.
A parent may feel overwhelmed and unable to speak publicly. They may be advised to prioritize communication with police over the media. They may fear their words will be misquoted or misunderstood. In regional and remote communities in particular, there is often a natural reluctance to step into the national spotlight. When the father finally did speak, the contrast between earlier quiet and new visibility made his appearance stand out, regardless of the content. Psychology offers useful context for understanding these dynamics. When a child goes missing, parents experience a level of shock, fear, and helplessness that is difficult to fully express. Reactions can vary widely from person to person. Some parents become very active in the public space, giving interviews, making appeals, fronting media conferences. Others turn inward, focusing on direct cooperation with police and trying to manage their immediate emotional survival. Neither response can be taken as an indicator of innocence or involvement. They are simply different ways of coping with extreme distress. Specialists in trauma and grief note that public exposure can intensify the emotional burden on families. Facing cameras, answering questions, and hearing speculation about their child can magnify feelings of vulnerability. For some parents, the idea of discussing their child's disappearance on television is unbearable, especially when they have not yet processed what has happened. For others, speaking publicly becomes a way to regain a sense of agency and to keep the search in the public mind. The decision to appear, or not appear, often changes over time, as shock gives way to exhaustion, and exhaustion gives way to a more measured but still painful acceptance that the situation may not resolve quickly. There is also a significant difference between private grief and public behavior. A parent might appear composed on camera, speaking calmly and without tears, yet be struggling deeply in private. Another might be visibly emotional, struggling to form sentences, and later be judged unfairly for being too upset or not upset enough. These judgments are based on expectations rather than reality. Behavior in front of a camera is mediated by self-consciousness, fatigue, advice from others, and a desire not to say something they will regret later. It is not a direct window into what they feel. In the Lamont case, the father's eventual appearance came after a period in which other family members had been the primary public faces of the search and the appeal for information. When he chose to speak, viewers brought their own assumptions to the moment. Some interpreted his step forward as a sign that he was ready to contribute more actively to the public discussion. Others wondered whether new developments had prompted him to appear. In truth, without direct confirmation from him or from SAPOL, the motivation behind his timing remains private. What is clear is that, from a psychological perspective, it is entirely consistent for a parent to take weeks or months before feeling able to address the public. The role of the media in shaping perceptions cannot be ignored. Journalists and producers must balance public interest with fairness and sensitivity. Even when reporting is careful and factual, the simple act of highlighting a parent's appearance can influence how audiences interpret it. Phrases such as "speaks out for the first time" or "breaks his silence" can unintentionally frame the event as more dramatic or confrontational than it was in reality. While such language is common in headlines and introductions, It may reinforce the idea that earlier silence was unusual, when in fact it is not. At the same time, true crime storytelling, whether in long-form journalism, television, or online video, often focuses on key beats in a narrative: first statements, emotional interviews, and changes in tone. The father's appearance naturally fits into this structure as a significant beat. Responsible coverage emphasizes that his decision to speak does not confirm or deny any theory. It simply adds another layer to the human side of the case. In a well-handled Australian true crime context, the goal is to explore that layer without implying causation or blame. Understanding why many parents do not appear immediately after a disappearance is important here. The early stages of a missing child case are typically occupied with intense practical and emotional demands. Answering police questions, coordinating with extended family, dealing with the media presence outside their home, and trying to absorb the reality of what has happened. For some parents, the energy required to stand in front of a camera and speak coherently is simply not available in those first days. Others may believe that media work is not their strength and that they might inadvertently harm the investigation by misspeaking. Cultural background, personality, previous experience with the media, and advice from support services all shape these decisions. Over time, as the case remains unresolved and formal search operations scale back, some parents find themselves in a position where they feel both a responsibility and a readiness to speak. The father's appearance in this case fits that broader pattern. It came at a point where public interest remained, but official updates had become less frequent. The community still wanted to understand where the investigation stood. His decision to speak can be seen as a response to that ongoing interest, a way of reasserting that the search for answers is not over, even if visible activity on the ground has decreased. However, media framing and public discussion sometimes misinterprets silence as avoidance or distance. When a parent has not been visible, speculation can grow, especially in online spaces where information is often incomplete and unfiltered. People may begin to ask why they have not spoken, whether they are hiding something, or why their behavior does not match expectations shaped by other cases. These reactions are understandable, but not reliable. They are driven by narrative comparison rather than evidence. Every family and every parent responds differently to trauma. This is where one key principle must be emphasized. Behavior under stress is highly variable. There is no correct way for a parent to act when their child is missing. Some appear calm, others appear overwhelmed. Some are outspoken, others withdraw. These differences do not indicate guilt or innocence. They simply reflect individual personalities, coping mechanisms, and circumstances. Investigators are trained to account for this variability. They assess statements and actions within the broader context of verified facts, not public expectations. In the end, the attention generated by the father's appearance says more about the unresolved nature of the case than it does about him as an individual. His presence filled a void in the public narrative at a time when many people were still seeking closure. For some, hearing his voice reinforced the human reality behind the headlines. This is not just a mystery, but a family still living with uncertainty. For others, it prompted renewed speculation and scrutiny, illustrating how easily intense emotions can shift focus from the evidence to the people closest to it. A careful, factual analysis must resist that drift. The father's decision to speak, the timing of his appearance, and the tone of his comments are all relevant in understanding how the community experiences the case. But they do not change the core realities. SAPOL continues to investigate. There is no evidence of foul play, and the disappearance of Gus remains an open and unresolved event in a harsh and complex landscape. Any interpretation of his appearance must remain grounded in those facts, acknowledging the diversity of human responses to trauma and the limits of what can be inferred from public behavior alone. In any missing child investigation, police rely heavily on the people who know the child best. This is not because those individuals are viewed with suspicion,
but because they can provide essential context that cannot be gathered through physical evidence alone. In the disappearance of 4-year-old Gus Lamont, the father occupies a unique position.
Although SAPOL has made it clear that there is no evidence of foul play, investigators recognize that he may hold pieces of information, large or small, that help clarify what occurred in the crucial early period. The most direct questions naturally relate to the first 30 minutes after Gus was last seen. These moments are critical in every search operation, particularly in remote environments where daylight, visibility, and changing weather conditions can quickly erase signs of movement. Police often begin with a simple but important query. Where was each family member during that window? The father's account of his location, what he was doing, and when he became aware of the situation can help confirm the internal timeline that guides the entire investigation. Such information also assists search coordinators in mapping the earliest possible directions a child might have taken. Another important area involves observations of anything unusual earlier in the day. Parents often notice subtle shifts in routine, mood, or behavior, details that may appear minor at the time but can become relevant in hindsight. Investigators commonly ask whether the child seemed tired, unsettled, or more active than usual, and whether there were changes in their willingness to stay close to adults. These questions are not designed to cast doubt on the parent. Rather, they help build a behavioral profile that search teams use to predict likely patterns of movement. Police may also ask whether anyone had visited the homestead in the hours or days before the disappearance. On large rural properties, unexpected visitors are uncommon but not impossible. Contractors, delivery drivers, neighboring station workers, or travelers passing through may all come into contact with a property without leaving obvious traces. The father is often in a position to recall such interactions, even if they seemed routine at the time. These recollections help determine whether any external factor could have influenced the environment around the homestead on the day Gus went missing. Questions about Gus's behavior in the days leading up to the disappearance also carry weight. Children sometimes express curiosity, independence, or a desire to explore, and parents naturally take note of these tendencies. If Gus had recently shown more confidence in wandering around the property, or if he had been particularly drawn to certain areas of the land, this information could shape the modeling used to predict where he might have walked. Conversely, if he had appeared anxious, unwell, or unusually quiet, investigators would interpret that differently. The father's insight into these patterns is an essential part of the investigative process. In addition, SAPOL often seeks clarification about a child's typical habits. A parent can describe how far the child usually roamed, what paths he took, and whether he preferred open areas or sheltered spots. Such information becomes valuable when search teams attempt to reconstruct possible routes. For example, if Gus tended to follow natural features such as fence lines, shallow ruts, or dry creek beds, search coordinators may prioritize those areas even if there are no visible tracks. Only parents or close carers can provide this level of personal detail. The father may also be able to answer questions that relate directly to the landscape surrounding the homestead. In remote Australia, local knowledge plays a critical role. Parents often know where children like to play, which parts of the property feel safe or off-limits, and where hazards such as sharp drops or thick scrub might cause a child to hesitate. Investigators frequently ask whether there were any areas Gus avoided, whether he was afraid of animals or machinery, or whether he had a habit of hiding when overwhelmed. Answers to these questions help refine search boundaries and interpret gaps in the physical evidence. There are also broader questions that remain outside public reporting, not because they are controversial, but because SAPOL does not release every detail of its interviews. This is standard practice. Investigators typically ask about the timing and tone of family interactions, the last conversations with the child, and any unusual sounds or movements noticed around the homestead that afternoon. They may also explore routine patterns. Who usually supervises the child at certain times, how chores are divided, and whether the day of the disappearance differed from the norm. None of these questions imply wrongdoing. They simply form the foundation of a thorough investigative timeline. The father's role extends beyond clarifying movements and habits. He can also help construct a fuller picture of Gus's temperament. Was he easily startled? Did he tend to run or freeze when frightened? Did he seek comfort from adults, or did he try to resolve situations on his own? Search theorists emphasize that small behavioral tendencies can influence the direction a child chooses in a moment of uncertainty. For example, a child who becomes confused may walk faster and less predictably than a child who seeks shelter. A parent's description of these traits provides invaluable context. Another area under consideration is whether the father noticed any environmental cues before the disappearance, changes in wind, unusual animal behavior, or anything out of place around the property. Even small details, such as a gate left open or a tool moved from its usual spot, can become relevant when investigators attempt to map the sequence of events. In missing child cases in Australia, none of these questions are unique or targeted. They form part of a structured, systematic process that police follow regardless of family background or circumstances. The father is one piece of a larger framework designed to eliminate uncertainty where possible and to interpret uncertainty where it cannot be removed. His answers help reinforce the timeline, refine the search parameters, and ensure that no potential avenue is overlooked. In this context, the questions he may be able to answer do not imply blame or suspicion. They reflect the reality that family members, simply by being closest to the child, have insights no one else can provide. Their knowledge helps shape the direction of the investigation and ensures that every plausible scenario is considered carefully and respectfully. In long-running missing child cases, it is common for members of the public to explore every possible scenario, including the involvement of immediate family. This pattern is not unique to the disappearance of 4-year-old Gus Lamont. It is a recurring theme in many investigations across Australia and internationally. When a case produces little physical evidence, when searches fail to uncover clear leads, and when official updates slow down, people naturally begin to ask questions that stem from uncertainty rather than confirmed information. The father's role in the narrative has attracted interest for several reasons, even though SAPOL has repeatedly stated that there is no evidence of foul play and no indication of wrongdoing by any family member. Understanding why these questions arise and why they persist requires looking at common public reactions, standard investigative procedures, and the natural human tendency to fill gaps when information feels incomplete. The first reason some individuals raise questions about the father involves his initial silence. In high-profile disappearances, particularly those involving young children, it is not uncommon for the public to expect immediate statements from both parents. When one parent becomes more visible while the other remains out of sight, curiosity often grows. This reaction is shaped more by media familiarity than by investigative logic. Many people have seen cases in which parents appear on camera within hours, making emotional appeals or providing updates. When a parent chooses not to follow that pattern, their absence is sometimes interpreted as unusual, even though it may reflect personal coping style, cultural background, or advice from police. From an investigative standpoint, the silence itself is not unusual. Police often advise family members to limit public statements, especially in the early stages of a search. This is not because investigators suspect them, but because inconsistency under stress is common and can unintentionally create confusion. Parents who are in shock may struggle to articulate details clearly. A misplaced word or an unclear phrase could distract from the search effort or inadvertently prompt unnecessary speculation. For this reason, some families choose to keep communication private, focusing on working directly with police. The second factor sometimes discussed publicly is the father's later appearance in the media. As the investigation progressed and after several phases of the search had concluded without findings, his re-entry into the public conversation was interpreted by some as noteworthy. However, the timing of a parent's decision to speak publicly does not indicate involvement or lack of involvement. It usually reflects emotional readiness, external pressure,
or a desire to support the ongoing search months after the initial shock. Many parents in similar cases across Australia have waited weeks or months before feeling able to publicly address the situation.
Understanding these reactions requires some insight into investigative procedures used by South Australia Police. In any missing child investigation, family members are routinely interviewed multiple times. This is not a sign of suspicion. It is standard practice designed to refine the timeline, confirm details, and identify any inconsistencies that may stem from misunderstanding rather than malice. Police recognize that people under severe emotional strain may recall events in fragments. Follow-up interviews give investigators the opportunity to verify information and ensure the search teams are guided by the most accurate timeline possible. The father, like any close family member, would have undergone this process. His statements, like those of others, would have been checked against physical evidence, environmental conditions, and accounts from other relatives. It is routine for police to revisit earlier statements as new information arises or as they reconsider the trajectory of the case. Having a statement checked multiple times does not mean it is suspected of being false. It means investigators are ensuring every element aligns with the broader investigative picture. A third factor sometimes raised in public discussion relates to behavior under pressure. Some viewers interpret calmness as indifference, while others interpret emotional restraint as evasiveness. These interpretations are often based on assumptions rather than evidence. Trauma experts consistently emphasize that human behavior under distress is extremely variable. Some people cry, others shut down. Some appear composed, others struggle to speak. None of these reactions reliably indicate guilt or innocence. They simply reflect individual coping mechanisms. When looking at the questions people raise, it is essential to compare this case with other missing child cases in Northern Territory, Queensland, and South Australia. In numerous examples, parental behaviour that initially drew speculation was eventually understood as a normal stress response. In fact, in most Australian cases involving young children, especially in remote areas, the parents are thoroughly interviewed, their timelines assessed, and then they are eliminated from suspicion once police confirm there is no evidence of involvement. The public rarely sees the full investigative framework behind these decisions, which can leave room for misunderstanding. One of the most important points in evaluating the father-related theory is the absence of physical evidence pointing toward family involvement. In many cases where a family member is responsible, investigators find inconsistencies in the timeline, forensic anomalies, or traces of disturbance around the home or property. SAPOL has made clear that none of these indicators exist in the Lamont case. There is no evidence of violence, no signs of staged activity, and no contradictions released to the public. The statements from police have remained consistent. No evidence of foul play. And all possibilities remain open. These phrases are carefully chosen. They acknowledge that every scenario is theoretically possible in a case with little evidence, but they also indicate that no scenario, including one involving a family member, is supported by facts. Another important aspect to consider is the environment where Gus disappeared. The outback is vast, harsh, and unpredictable. The terrain can erase footprints, the wind can scatter soil patterns, and the soft ground around homesteads can be disturbed by livestock or natural movement within minutes. Investigative theories that might be plausible in suburban settings often do not apply in remote regions of South Australia. A lack of physical evidence, therefore, does not point toward any specific theory. It simply reflects the unforgiving nature of the landscape. To understand why investigators must still consider all possibilities, including those involving family, it is necessary to look at standard investigative procedure. In every missing child case, regardless of location or family background, the first step involves establishing a confirmed timeline. This requires obtaining precise accounts from everyone who last saw the child. Police check distances, time estimates, and environmental conditions. They verify statements against physical markers, such as the position of the sun, shadows, footprints,
vehicle tracks, and natural features around the property. In cases where a timeline cannot be fully verified due to the environment or the lack of witnesses, investigators must leave open the theoretical possibility of multiple explanations.
This does not mean they consider all possibilities equally likely. It simply means they cannot formally eliminate any scenario until evidence confirms or contradicts it. In remote cases like this one, where little evidence exists, many scenarios remain open longer than they would in an urban setting. Another aspect often misunderstood by the public is the role of Task Force Horizon. This specialized group reviews evidence, statement consistency, and modeling from various experts, including behavioral analysts and search specialists. Their involvement does not indicate suspicion of any individual. Instead, it reflects the seriousness of the case and the complexity of searching in a remote environment. When they reassess a statement from a family member, including the father, they do so within a structured, evidence-focused framework. Their aim is to verify alignment between human accounts and environmental possibility, not to assign blame. Looking at comparable cases across NT, QLD, and SA reveals a clear pattern. Initial public suspicion towards family members is common, but rarely supported by investigative findings. In many of those cases, parents were later shown to have had no involvement whatsoever, despite early speculation. Public theories often arise not because of evidence, but because of the psychological discomfort created by uncertainty. When a disappearance lacks clear answers, people gravitate towards explanations that feel concrete, even when they lack factual basis. In the Lamont case, the father-related theory exists primarily because the case itself is unresolved. Without clear evidence pointing toward any scenario, self-directed wandering, environmental hazard, misadventure, or third-party involvement, some members of the public turn their attention toward the people closest to the child. This reflects a natural human desire for closure, rather than any factual foundation. Based on all publicly available information, there is no data supporting the idea that the father was involved. No contradiction has been identified in relation to his statements. No physical evidence suggests misconduct. No behavioral markers traditionally associated with involvement appear in the investigation. SAPOL has not named him as a person of interest, nor have they implied his involvement in any direct or indirect way. At the same time, because the case lacks conclusive evidence pointing in any direction, the father-related theory remains one of many theoretical possibilities. It is not prioritized, nor is it formally dismissed. It simply exists in the background of a case where investigators cannot eliminate scenarios due to the absence of confirming or disproving information. Ultimately, the father-related theory reflects the broader reality of unresolved disappearances. When evidence is scarce, theory fills the gaps. From an investigative standpoint, there is no indication that this hypothesis holds weight. From a public perspective, it remains part of the conversation because the case is deeply emotional, deeply mysterious, and deeply unresolved. A careful factual summary shows the following. There is no evidence supporting the theory. There is no confirmed inconsistency in the father's statements. There is no forensic indication of wrongdoing. The search environment can easily erase physical traces. Family involvement is a standard investigative consideration in all missing child cases. Most such theories in Australian cases are eventually ruled out. For now, the theory remains open in the technical sense only because the case itself remains open. It is not reinforced by evidence and is not treated as a primary direction by investigators. It stands as one of many possibilities in a disappearance defined by uncertainty rather than confirmed facts. As the investigation into the disappearance of 4-year-old Gus Lamont enters its later stages, the father's recent appearance stands as one of the most discussed developments in the case. His presence has drawn attention not because it points to wrongdoing, but because it adds another piece to an incomplete picture. In a case defined by uncertainty, every new voice and every clarified detail becomes part of the broader search for understanding.
The significance of his appearance lies not in implication, but in context. It tells us something about the ongoing efforts of the family, the public response, and the approach taken by South Australia Police. To start, it is important to restate the central factual point. The father's appearance does not prove anything negative. It does not shift the investigative focus, and it does not imply that the family is under suspicion.
SAPOL has been consistent across all public communications. There is no evidence of foul play, no evidence of harm within the family, and no confirmation that any particular scenario is more likely than another. In the absence of physical findings, investigators must keep all possibilities technically open. But that openness should not be misunderstood as a sign of direction. The father's involvement in public communication simply marks a new moment in the timeline of the case rather than a shift in its meaning. His appearance does, however, open the door to new information, not in the sense of revelations, but through clarity. When a parent chooses to speak publicly, they often expand on earlier details or articulate their experience in ways that were previously private. Even when no new facts emerge, hearing the parent's perspective allows the public to understand the emotional and logistical context behind the family's cooperation with police. It reinforces the reality that behind the headlines is a family living through a prolonged and painful uncertainty. For investigators, a parent's public statement rarely changes the formal direction of the case. Their information is gathered primarily through recorded interviews, structured questioning, and follow-up sessions conducted by trained detectives. Public statements serve instead to reassure the community that the family is engaged and communicative. In situations where false rumors or misunderstandings have circulated online, the parent's voice can help reset expectations, especially when speculation has focused unfairly on family behavior. The father's appearance in this case functions partly in that role. It demonstrates ongoing cooperation and reminds the public that official information, not assumptions, remains the most reliable guide. One of the core responsibilities of SAPOL in a case of this nature is to prevent premature closure. The phrase often used, "no closure until evidence says so," is not a simple slogan. It reflects a disciplined investigative mindset, especially in remote area disappearances where weather, terrain, and time can erase evidence quickly. For police, closure must come from verifiable, tangible findings. Without those findings, the case cannot be formally concluded, and it cannot be restricted to a single theory. The father's appearance reinforces this ongoing status. It signals that the investigation remains active and that the people closest to Gus are still engaged. It also emphasizes that the lack of resolution has emotional consequences that extend far beyond procedural updates. Within the South Australian community, the father's appearance has shaped public sentiment in subtle ways. Many residents of regional areas understand the weight of outback conditions and the harsh realities of remote searches. Their reaction has been a mixture of hope, caution, and sympathy. On one hand, some see his presence as a sign that the family continues to hold out hope for answers. On the other hand, South Australians are keenly aware that prolonged cases often bring emotional fatigue. They recognise that the landscape itself makes the disappearance extraordinarily difficult to interpret. These dual feelings, hope but restraint, mirror the broader tone of public discussion throughout the state. The psychological aspect of the father's role is also worth noting. A parent who comes forward after a long period of silence has to navigate the emotional landscape of grief, scrutiny, and expectation. Speaking publicly is not straightforward, especially when every word may be interpreted by thousands of viewers. His appearance indicates a level of emotional readiness, even if that readiness comes months after the disappearance. This timing should not be misread. Trauma does not follow a schedule, and the moment someone chooses to speak publicly cannot be used as a measure of involvement or guilt. It is simply a reflection of where they are in a long and painful process. From an analytical perspective, the father's re-entry into the public narrative also serves a procedural purpose. It gives the community another reference point,
a reminder that behind the search grids, aerial scans, and modeling projections stands a family trying to understand what happened to their child. In missing child cases, public empathy can fade over time as active search efforts slow. A parent's appearance often renews attention without shifting the focus away from the facts. In that sense, his decision to speak may help maintain visibility for the case at a time when official updates are becoming less frequent. Another aspect to consider is the way this appearance interacts with speculation.
In many missing person cases, public discussion tends to fill voids created by a lack of evidence. When a parent remains silent, some individuals interpret that silence as meaningful. When the parent eventually speaks, others may interpret the timing as significant. Neither interpretation is reliable. SAPOL's role is to separate noise from fact, and the father's appearance does not alter their investigative approach. What it does contribute is additional context that helps counter unsupported assumptions. His willingness to speak reinforces the message that the family is not withholding information. They are participating in a process guided by the police, not the public. In reviewing the broader implications, it is helpful to consider similar cases across Australia. In numerous outback disappearances, particularly in NT, WA, and QLD, parents have entered the public conversation months or even years after the initial event. Their appearances rarely signal new investigative directions. Instead, they often reflect the emotional rhythms of long-running uncertainty. The father's presence aligns with this pattern. It suggests ongoing engagement rather than a sudden shift in circumstances. The central question, then, is whether his appearance brings the investigation closer to the truth. The answer is nuanced. It does not provide new evidence, and therefore it does not narrow the investigative field. It does not confirm or eliminate any scenario. But it does create space for renewed public attention, which can be valuable in cases where new information might emerge from witnesses who previously believed the matter had been resolved or quietened. People's memories fade, their sense of urgency diminishes. A parent's voice can reignite that urgency, even when the investigative team remains steady in its approach. More importantly, his appearance shows that the search for answers continues, not only through formal channels, but also through personal commitment. Families in long-term missing child cases often fear that the public will move on while they remain suspended in uncertainty. By speaking publicly, the father reinforces a clear message. The case is not abandoned, and the family has not let go of the hope that clarity will eventually come. In this sense, his presence serves as a bridge between the emotional landscape of the family and the procedural landscape of the investigation. For SAPOL, the father's appearance offers another opportunity to reiterate their principles. Their statements remain consistent. The investigation is ongoing. All possibilities remain open, and no scenario will be treated as confirmed or dismissed until the evidence supports such a conclusion. This consistency is central to maintaining public confidence and to ensuring that no single theory becomes dominant without factual foundation. In a case with little physical evidence, maintaining this disciplined neutrality is essential. The broader public, particularly in rural and regional South Australia, understands the gravity of a disappearance in harsh terrain. The father's voice adds a human dimension to the procedural updates. It reminds the community that behind search grids and tactical modelling is a family navigating a reality of uncertainty. While his appearance does not bring the case closer to resolution in the forensic sense, it strengthens the emotional connection between the public and the search for answers. In the end, the meaning of the father's appearance is neither suspicious nor conclusive. It is simply significant in the human sense. It shows that the family remains engaged. It brings renewed attention to a case that has not been closed. It encourages the community to remain alert, and it allows SAPOL to reinforce the message that the search for truth continues. The key takeaway is that his appearance supports the investigation by sustaining visibility, reinforcing cooperation, and countering unfounded speculation. It does not prove or disprove any theory. It does not alter the core facts.
It simply adds another dimension to an already complex and unresolved narrative. The investigation remains open. The family continues to cooperate. SAPOL maintains its disciplined approach, and the community of South Australia continues to hope, quietly, cautiously, that answers may still emerge.